wanted to get my new Confederate Zouaves into the game, give them their first test here in Sharps practice. And so this is the battlefield. It's in early 1862. We'll say it's in Virginia. And basically a Union task force will be entering from, this is one of their entry points, and then the other entry point is over in that wood. They are charged with securing this crossroads and holding it at all costs. The Confederates, on the other hand, will be entering from that wood there. That'll be their main entry point. And then they have a secondary entry point here at the barn. And so they're tasked with also getting the crossroads. Now, clearly, the Union has the advantage to start off because they're closer. And but we'll see what the Confederates can do. Ranges in this game are extremely long, so wherever you set up, and it'll come down to who kind of gets first volleys, whose chips come up. And a major advantage that the rebels have, I think, is they get to do rebel yell. So with 2 flags, they can fire and then charge 3. So that might be a huge help to them if they can get close enough. So anyway, each side has 10 big men and about equal forces. I think the Confederates is a little bit larger with one group of skirmishers more. So anyway, I'll report back after turn 1. Turn 1 saw a lot of red chips being pulled first. The first chip drawn was for this Confederate group of 2 skirmishers, so they are making their way to try to hold the crossroads until the line infantry can get up, and then the second group also. This large group got on the table, but then there was a random event after 3 flags were drawn, and their colonel here sprained his ankle, so they're at -1 pip. 4 flags were drawn. I tried to cash those in to give them an extra move to get going since they were going to be slowed down anyway, but it would be -2 because of the rough terrain, and then because of the random events thing, they rolled a 6, so they basically didn't move at all. The 2 Louisiana Tiger units came onto the table, which was good for the Confederacy. On the Union side, they got a lot. They got both their skirmishers on, and then 3 of their infantry groups came on. So they're going to try to get down and secure those crossroads. They certainly have the advantage, but I'm sure those skirmishers over here will try to pick off as many of them as possible. So that's the end of turn 1. Turn 2 saw both sides continuing to advance on the crossroads. No action as of yet, but I would imagine the next turn the Confederate skirmishers, who got to advance significantly, will start popping off at their targets. This column right here is a particularly juicy one. The one group of skirmishers has occupied the churchyard there, and then Beard's sharpshooters are here. So they're going to contest those skirmishers, I'm sure. And on the Confederate side, the large column there, they were able to get out of the woods, so they'll be coming on pretty strongly. And then these Zouaves used 4 flags to get a double march to come down that road, but didn't roll very high, so they're still kind of lagging behind. Both artillery units are on for each side, so they'll be maneuvering those. So that's the end of turn 2. Turn 3 really saw some things kick into action. The first blood was drawn by those skirmishers over there on the right flank of the Union. They fired at a column, and so they took out a figure and added some shock to those guys there. After the tiffin, they used a flag to break into line. And then other units continued to march up the road. And these Zouaves are coming on. And this group finally came on, taking advantage of that second entry point there. So large Confederate units. But then the real story of this turn was these skirmishers for the Confederates. They got to draw. And these two groups fired on those three groups while they were still in column and did a lot of damage. They killed one figure, did shock, and then these guys fired at them after they've gotten into line and inflicted just another point of shock. Perhaps the biggest disappointment for the Union were the vaunted Burton's sharpshooters fired at these skirmishers, and nothing. No, they had a few hits, but then the result was 1s and 2s, so they didn't inflict any damage on those skirmishers. So the Union's moving up and shaking into line, so they have a very formidable force here, but it's just not been moving very quickly at all. So now we'll be moving on to turn 4. Turn 4 is finished, and on this turn a lot happened. On the Confederate left flank here, the Union sharpshooters, or the Union skirmishers there, fired a volley and basically inflicted a little shock, but they did have one casualty, in that they rolled a 1, and it turned out to be the colonel. He was knocked out, but on his subsequent activation, he rolled a 6, so he came back, so that was lucky. These guys were able to move up. The column here in the barn did not move up very well. They just rolled 1 inch. They rolled a 2 and a 1, and -1 because of the barrier, so these skirmishers fired and inflicted a little bit of shock on the Zouaves there in the woods. But the big story was that this unit finally got off a volley and took out one of these skirmishers and inflicted some shock, and then they cashed in 4 flags and fired another volley. And so these guys are up to 4 shock, 7, 6, and on that second volley they lost 2 figures. So Union firepower is coming into play, and you can see the number of troops coming up and behind, so they're going to be formidable. Once again, however, Bearden's sharpshooters they pulled their last. They were the last ones to fire. They fired their 8 shots at these skirmishers, had 1 hit, and then rolled a 2. So they did absolutely no damage once again. So that's the end of turn 4, and I would certainly have to say that it went to the Union troops on this particular round. Turn 5 was quite eventful, and again I think it went the Union's way more than the Confederates. Of note, this 3-group formation was able to fire a volley, and their target was these 2 groups of Zouaves who were in column, and so they did inflicted a lot of shock and broke both the formation, drove them back, so they lost 2 points of morale for bad things that happened. These also took casualties and were driven back. The Confederates got some licks in. These skirmishers fired at the Zouaves here in the woods and inflicted one casualty on the group on the right. They rolled a 1, which meant that it was the commander that was hit, and so he's slightly wounded. They didn't lose any morale for that. But the other thing that was kind of interesting is a bad thing happened. 3 flags were drawn right after these guys fired their volley, and a 2 was rolled. And that result is a nasty volley. And so the commanding officer apparently wandered into the front and got shot in the backside. So now he's gone from a level 4 commander, because he's their lead commander, down to a level 3. And then over on the far left of the Confederates, that four group formation, their chip wasn't drawn, but they used a flag to fire a volley at the skirmishers that are there by the tree, and basically killed 3 of the men and inflicted 5 points of shock, and so they were driven back. So they lost a point of morale for that. And once again, burdened sharpshooters fired a 3rd volley, and after the smoke cleared, had only inflicted 1 point of shock. So Bearden's men are a huge disappointment. So that's how things rounded out for turn 5, and now we'll move ahead on to turn 6. Turn 6 was rather brief. The Tiffin card came up pretty quickly, and most of the chips that were drawn, not a lot of firing this turn, but a lot of movement. So this group of Zouaves came up and broke into a line. These skirmishers pulled back to the cover of the fence. They were starting to take some damage. Then this large group of Confederates rolled really well, and they rolled an 11, and so they were able to move up and take position along the fence. And then the group on the other side there of 4 groups moved up too. So the Confederates are basically forming their position here along this fence. For the Union, this group, the flag was, the Tiffin card came, so the Union had 3 flags. So they used 1 flag to move these guys up, down. This is a hill, about 3 contours, and so these guys moved up, and then the artillery, like the cannon, unlimbered and fired at the Zouaves and didn't do a lot of execution. Nobody was killed, but I think 3 points of shock. It drove back that unit, but nothing happened in terms of morale. And then this group of Zouaves rolled really well, but there was a 3rd flag was pulled, and so they actually got another die to their movement, so they got to move all the way up here. So that's kind of it. The skirmishers, the 3rd flag was used to pull back the pretty beaten up regular skirmishers there. Bearden's tag was drawn. They fired a volley, inflicted 1 point of shock, and then moved off to their right to kind of throw some kind of resistance up against the Confederates that are coming down on that flank. So that's what happened, and the battery also, the Confederate gun got to move up. Now there's no contours on this side of the battlefield, unfortunately. So if they're going to be coming to action, they're going to have to find a place in the line here so they can do some execution. So it looks like it's going to develop into a pretty significant firefight here. The Confederate right has taken a lot of beatings, so we'll see what happens if they can stand up to it, and we'll move on to turn 7. Turn 10 was one of the most remarkable turns I've ever had in a game of sharp practice. For the whole game, I had hoped to be able to pull off a rebel yell, but that means you have to draw the chip. But when you draw the chip, you need at least 2 flags to institute the rebel yell. Well, the chips fell amazingly in favor of the Confederates on this particular turn. And the unit over there on the far left, 2 flags were on the table, and the commander's card came up. So they fired a volley at 2 groups of skirmishers over there, and then they rolled to see if they could close, and they came up just a little bit short. So continued to draw chips, and 3 flags in a row came out, and so that meant a random event, and it was a movement. And the movement, the roll was a 6, which meant that they got to roll 1 more die, and that die came up to be a 6, which allowed them to close with the skirmishers and do fisticuffs. They completely destroyed one of the skirmishers and broke the other ones. And so the net result of all that fighting was that the Union morale dropped from 7 all the way down to 3. And if that weren't enough, later in the turn, this large group was able to also rebel yell. So they fired their volley. Unfortunately, the group there on the left had a lot of shock, which meant that they were limited in how far they were going to go. But they did get over the fence, and they're making their way. On the Union side, with shock just mounting up, rising, they are in a bad way. Their fire is basically dwindling. It's fading out because of the shock. They did get 2 groups over here on their right flank to try to shore that up, but it might be a little too late. So it looks like there might be 1 more turn, but as you can see, the shock, we've got 5, 6, 11 on that group there. 5, 8 back here on these guys. So just a couple well-placed shots, and it looks like this Union line is going to be falling apart. But that's why you play the game, so we'll see what happens in turn 11. The game has been fought to a conclusion. And as in turn 10, the chips fell very favorably to the Confederates, even more so in this final turn. The Union lost 2 flags because of their low morale. And as things unfolded, the largest units of the Confederacy drew their chips, and on this side they drew and got to fire, did a little bit of damage, but the telling blow of the turn was that this unit, their chip was drawn. They rolled a 12 for movement, so they were able basically to completely, despite some of the shock on them, turn and face the enemy there on the flank, so there wouldn't be any more flank shots. And then as the turn continued, there were 4 Confederate flags, which allowed this unit to reactivate, and they fired a volley into the Union in front of them and did just enough damage to basically break the Bearden sharpshooters, force back by 3 or 4 inches one of the units of this 2-group formation, broke the formation, drove them back, and so by the time all the bad things that happened rolls were resolved, the Union morale was 0. So it was quite a battle, very, very fun, I have to say. I really, really enjoyed this game. The Zouaves on the Union side, you can see they're just battered. The Confederate Zouaves were not in much better shape, but they never really got into the game. They came up and took a lot of damage, and but they did hold down an equal number, if not more, of their counterparts on the Union side. So anyway, really, really fun game. just all the elements that I'd never really had encountered before came into play. And so I'm looking forward to next time, rather than being a Zouave battle, I want to use my cavalry because I've got disrounded units and things like that. So anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to the next time. Take care. God bless. Bye.